Welcome to another episode of Angelicum Conversations, a new interview series of the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas here in Rome, where we explore theology, philosophy, and culture in conversation with leading scholars from around the world. Our guest today is Professor John Haldane, who is coming from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where he has taught philosophy since 1983. Professor Haldane is perhaps best known as a moral philosopher, but he has also taught and researched in philosophy of mind, history of philosophy, and philosophy of art, among other topics. Professor Haldane has held many visiting professorships and fellowships at universities around the world, and we're fortunate to have had him here at the Angelicum as a visiting professor just this past semester. Our conversation today is about a lecture that Professor Haldane gave recently in Rome, entitled Philosophies via Media, Between Quietism and Activism. Professor Haldane, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
So, if you'll permit me, let's step back a moment to set the stage to the question you're framing, especially in your lecture. Generally speaking, I take you to be saying that there are two paths usually taken in contemporary philosophy, in particular as regards the way it's done, and that you are arguing for a middle path via media between them, one that takes the best attributes of both and disposes the rest. How do you understand these two paths, and how do you think philosophy got here to this point? On your account, what is philosophy for?
Well, perhaps I can come to the last question a little later on, just by setting things up. When we say how did we get here, I think the best place to start is probably the end of the 19th century, rather than, as it were, with Plato and Aristotle. I think what happened was this, that particularly in continental Europe, there was an immense movement in philosophy that is connected with the Enlightenment in the 18th century. And the principal figure in that would be Kant. But then in the 19th century, Hegel, who in one respect is a critic of Kant, but in another respect continues the Kantian project. What is that project? Well, it's an attempt to try to reconstruct the central areas of philosophy and the answers to the central questions of philosophy about the nature of reality, the nature of human beings, and so on, in ways that invoke the idea that in some sense the world, reality, is itself a minded kind of entity, as it were. And the question is, how could that be? How could it be that the reality exhibited a kind of intelligibility? Well, one ancient answer to that was the Platonic answer, because it's structured by the forms, which are these abstract principles, and we have intellects that are resonate, as it were, to forms, and so on. But that didn't any longer seem plausible to many people. So what they were moving towards was the idea that in some sense, the distinction between mind and reality itself had to be dissolved, that there's some sense in which the mind-like character of reality is connected with our own minds. Now, you could summarize that briefly by calling this idealism, a certain kind of idealism. And in the 19th century, this had developed and developed and developed, and it was really the dominant philosophical view. Here in Italy, for example, I mean, it was everywhere, but here in Italy, Benedetto Croce, for example, would be an instance of that. Later in the 20th century, Gentile and various Italian metaphysicians. In Britain, it took root. But what happened was that towards the end of the 19th century, there was a reaction against idealism. And it was an assertion of realism, the thought that, no, mind is one thing, reality is another, and we mustn't, as it were, mix them up. There is, of course, a question about how we know reality, but what we know when we know reality is something other than ourselves. And that move was led in part in Germany by the philosopher of mathematics, mathematician and philosopher of mathematics, Gottlieb Frege, but in the UK by Bertrand Russell and by G.E. Moore in Cambridge, and then by Wittgenstein, who's really a sort of bridge between Frege on the one hand. Wittgenstein's Austrian, but he spoke German. That was the language there. But he's a bridge really between Frege in continental Europe and Russell and G.E. Moore in Cambridge. And what they do is they push back very hard against idealism. Now, this gives rise to a conception of philosophy that becomes, as it were, forensic, clinical, and distanced from these big metaphysical impulses. It says, look, the task of philosophy is not to try to tell us about the structure of reality in the grand scheme of things, but really just to try to understand, to have, as came to be called, perspicuous representations of our language, that we draw a distinction between the surface grammar of our language and the deep logical grammar. And using these logical techniques, it was engaged in a kind of, as I say, a forensic analysis, really. Now, that already produced a kind of quietism, because what it meant is, look, those sort of things that had kept the hearts beating in Europe, in idealism, romanticism, and so on, that's not the task of philosophy. Maybe the arts want to engage in that. Maybe, politicians want to engage in that. But the philosopher is a different sort of person. It's a kind of clinician who stands back. So that produced a general sort of what I might call a quietism about philosophy. But within that, there was a particular application of the quietist idea, which was to ethics. And this comes in G. Moore's Principia Ethica, in which he argues that the task of philosophy is not to say moral philosophy, is not to say what things are good, but what the concept good means. And so we've stepped away, really. First, it's a particular step away from the world, in this case, the ethical world, to really an analysis of concepts. And that produces essentially a kind of what I call a quietism, that philosophy says, well, our task, as it were, is therapeutic. It's to try to enable us to sort of iron out the wrinkles in our thinking, expose the bones beneath the flesh, but it's not, as it were, to itself be concerned with how we should live or what we should think about questions like God and so on. If that is a sensible question, and many thought it wasn't, it's not really the task of philosophy to be engaged with that. Philosophy, as it were, is this second-order discipline that is just looking at our first-order concerns and trying to expose the logical structure of that and see the arguments and so on. I can say a bit more about activism, but do you want to hold me there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's turn to this dominant tendency, which we are calling quietism. In your lecture, you identified two types of quietism: one that relates to philosophy as a whole, and one that relates to moral philosophy more particularly. Could you explain how you think these two kinds of quietism have impacted the way philosophy has been done in the last century or so?
Yeah. So let me just take the first one first. So as I said, the consequence of the Fregean revolution in logic, which gave us new techniques for analyzing language and so on, their adoption by Russell, who was himself a very gifted logician, and less formally by people like G. E. Moore, the result was, as I say, to focus on how to understand or how to map the structure of our ordinary ways of thinking. Now, by mid-century, this took a slightly different form. It's the same basic idea, but in Oxford, the philosopher Peter Strawson came to be a representative of what then was known as Oxford philosophy, or sometimes Oxford ordinary language philosophy or linguistic philosophy. And he said, look, we shouldn't assume that the surface structure of our language is radically misleading, which is what Wittgenstein, Frege, and Russell tended to think. Let's just actually look at it and let's just try to get a kind of clear picture of our ways of thinking. And he produced a book called Individuals, in which he successively explores the question of what is our basic conception of the structure of reality. And he said, well, it's got the idea of things, it's got the idea of events, it's got the idea of causality, it's got the idea of time, and so on. And this was just an exploration of those. But interestingly, in his preface to that book, he draws a distinction between what he called descriptive metaphysics, which is what he was engaging in, and revisionary metaphysics. So the revisionary metaphysician was as well the old-style metaphysician who says, well, we've got appearance and reality is completely different to the way things look. Strawson said, no, the task of philosophy is not, as it was, not a kind of science that's exposing the underlying structure of things. It's more to do with just trying to understand our thoughts, as it were, the structure of our thoughts. And it's entirely reasonable when we reflect on our thoughts. We see that these basic concepts of things, events, and so on are ones that we need. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a kind of quietism, but it's also, it introduces a program, really, which is, you might say, of descriptive philosophy, not revisionary philosophy. And then in the legacy of G. E. Moore and his suggestion that what we do is not think about what things are good, but what the concept good means, is a whole study, several iterations of the idea that what we need to do is understand the logic of moral judgments and aesthetic judgments, other value judgments, and so on. And this led to a series of theories about ethical language, which for the most part became increasingly subjectivist in their orientation. They said, look, when you really look at this, when we look at the logic of moral statements, when we look at, say, what somebody means when they say that this is good or this is right and so on, what they actually, the real form of them, they're not descriptions of facts. They're expressions of emotion, or their recommendations of how to act, or their directions as to how to act and so on. And so two things happened. One was just a general idea the task of philosophy is just to describe the language. But the inclination to think that when you describe the language, what it revealed was that the language wasn't as you thought it was. So the claims about morality are not claims about some objective fact. They're statements of commitment, or their undertakings, or their prescriptions. And something similar, by the way, around the same time, Second World War and the decade following it, had been happening in France and more extensively. They're under the guise of existentialism. But basically, you could say there's a sort of similar idea, or similar conclusion perhaps, different methods, similar conclusion. And the conclusion is that the ethical, as it were, is a sphere of commitment or personal view, as it were, not a sphere in which there is objective right or wrong, good or bad, thing and another. So I'd say the impacts, and for different reasons, I mean, partly in continental Europe, it was to do with this sort of sense of the breakdown of value. You know, if there really was objective value, how could we have had 2 world wars, the Holocaust and all the rest of it? It must just be what we've got are sort of rival ideologies. In Britain, it was the conclusion was arrived at somewhat differently through these sort of techniques of analysis and so on. But the joint conclusion seemed to be that the ethical is just a sphere of personal commitment or political advocacy or whatever else it may be. And this, by the way, gives rise to the next thing, perhaps, which is what I call activism in philosophy. And we could perhaps say something about that.
Yes, and just before we do, I just wanted to say, there's been a lot that's been done recently covering 4 Oxford women who came forward and shook up the scene a little bit. Elizabeth Anscombe, who you've worked on very closely. If you'd like to speak to that, did they contribute in some way to not undermining this, but breaking it up, allowing for...
Yes, I think so. I mean, the 4 Oxford women were Mary Midgley, Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, and Iris Murdoch. Different people in their own ways. I would sort of group Anscombe and Foot together. They were literally colleagues, I mean, in the same college and friends. And Murdoch and Midgley, I actually not put together exactly. I'd say each of those were different again. So you've got the Anscombe-Foot axis and then these other 2 perspectives. I can just say very quickly what those perspectives were, which might be helpful to people. Anscombe very famously in this, what was actually a talk to a student society, Modern Moral Philosophy, but really I think one of the most important essays of certainly the second half of the 20th century in moral philosophy, arguably even beyond that, but anyway, let's say that. She just looked at 18th and 19th century philosophers, Kant, John Stuart Mill and others and so on, but particularly she had in view her own generation and the generation immediately before it, the kind of people I've been talking about who were becoming increasingly sort of subjectivist and so on. And she was outraged by this because she thought that the age in which they were living, she'd gone up to Oxford just before the Second World War, but people had the memories of the First World War and then quickly the discovery of the atrocities of the Second World War. She thought it was just outrageous that people should think that there was no right and wrong, good and bad, and so on. Now, Foot and the others felt something similar, but what Anscombe did was offer a way of trying to ground right and wrong, good and bad, objectively, basically in human nature. And in that respect, her view is a kind of Aristotelian one and would be recognizable to a Thomist as well. And she was, by the way, influenced by some Thomistic authors because she had been tutored at Blackfriars in Oxford. And there was a man called Gerald Van, a Dominican then, who'd written a couple of, actually I think, rather good books. And I think if one actually looks at Van's writings, you can see the influence of them in modern moral philosophy. But anyway, so she was arguing that Foot followed in this modernized Aristotelianism. Murdoch was slightly different. Murdoch had a kind of more Platonic conception. She, of course, was came to fame more as an author, a literary author, a novelist, rather than as a philosopher. And of course, you could see, as it were, the imaginative spirit at work in her. I mean, she sort of idealizes the good. She doesn't think of it as something that's really in the world. It's something beyond the world in some sense. To some degree, I think of this as a kind of substitute for religion. She was an atheist, as was Philippa Foot. Mary Midgley's interesting. Mary Midgley was, I think, the least intellectually powerful of the four. I mean, she wasn't somebody who was conspicuously brilliant in argument and so on. But Midgley thought, if you're going to go the naturalist route, if you're going to say that good and bad are about what's conducive to human welfare, human flourishing, and so on, then you better know more about human nature. And she became quite interested in human beings as animals, basically, and our relation to the natural environment. And she produced this book, Man and Beast, and a series of other books and essays and so on, in which she was really arguing that, yes, the naturalist perspective is correct, but what we've said about nature so far as philosophers is utterly amateur. And so we really need to start to study this. And I knew Midgley and Anscombe directly. Midgley was a more an easier person to engage with. Anscombe was a rather eccentric character, but Midgley was a very sensible and thoughtful kind of. I don't mean to suggest that Anscombe had no sense, but Midgley is somebody you could just sit down and talk about these matters in a very bad way. And she didn't really, because she was a sort of more marginal academic figure, partly because she'd taken out years to raise a family and so on, she wasn't really particularly concerned with her position in academia, and she wasn't caught up in these battles which sometimes do as much to do with wills and standing as they are with the ideas. So she just kept going and kept going, and I think produced some very interesting work. But Anscombe, I suppose, was really has come to be seen as the most prominent. I've just want to add one remark about this. I do think that the grouping of them together is a sort of journalistic or publishing convenience. But I think they are quite different, and their relations, it wasn't as if they went around as a gang together. Right. Anscombe and Foot were close. Midgley had, by this point, was away from Oxford. Initially, she was working in civil service. She ended up in the north of England, and Murdoch was in London, but moving away from academic circles into literary circles. And of course, they were all quite different personalities. I'd say the most forceful personalities of the two would be Iris Murdoch and Elizabeth Anscombe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I agree with you. I think that it's there have been several volumes that have come out recently, which groups them together. But I think part of the narrative is that there was this very quietist, what you might call quietist scene going on there. Yeah, especially in the UK, the academic level. And these four women had to come in and shake things up.
Yes, I think that's true, by the way. I mean, and I would just say one other thing, add to that perhaps, which is a sort of sociological and psychological remark, really. You have to remember that Oxford philosophy, not just philosophy in Oxford, but philosophy in Britain, but particularly in Oxford, Cambridge and London, and in the Scottish universities, I'd say, was really most philosophers were men, and they were men who'd had a certain common kind of education, either a public school or independent, boarding school, prep school in the US language, or an independent day school education, which was sort of, to some extent, just reflected the same curricular structure as the public schools. And so they had a certain kind of education and formation, which brought with it or produced in them a kind of degree of personal confidence and social expectation. And of course, the war had added to that, because they were the officer class. They all went off and became officers. So I think they carried themselves with a certain assumption of superiority. And meanwhile, these women who were, didn't have those kinds of educations, or not, somewhat analogous, but generally not, and were, were not in war service and such like, were just thinking about life in a certain sort of way. And I think there was a tendency to dismiss them, to say, well, now when the war was over, the men are back, so we can resume the business. But no, they'd taken their years to think about these things. And it helped enormously. I mean, in some ways it was turbulent, but Anscombe's just, how should we say? I mean, she was a real bruiser. I mean, she was there with her fists, metaphorically. She wasn't going to take any patronizing or anything like that.
President Truman.
Absolutely,
That's
yes,
right.
absolutely. Yeah.
So, okay. Yeah, no, I mean, so we have this, what you're calling quietism, this, very descriptive kind of philosophy that creates a little bit of a gulf between thought and reality on the one hand. But then we have what you also call activism. So let's turn to that other tendency that you see that's very alive today. You identified again two different strands or forms of that philosophical activism which it can take. One that more generally takes a revisionary view of established structures and concepts, and one that relates more practically again to moral and political philosophy. Could you elaborate a bit
Sure.
on what you mean by
Well,
these
let's take the first of those before we get to the moral and the political, which is, I think, currently where things are most evidently prominent with activism. But let me start with the sort of the metaphysical or the general philosophical. Remember, I said that Strawson said the task of philosophy was really to just describe the basic geography of our concepts, the basic landscape of the various elements that are part of our ways of structuring our thought about the world. And so in that sense, it was essentially a conservative undertaking. I mean, it wasn't trying to sort of change our ways of thinking, it was just trying to understand them. Well, step forward several decades, maybe about 25 years, to the mid-1970s. And you've now got, there becomes a sort of explosion, particularly in the United States, so it has its influence more broadly, with a new kind of metaphysics, using the tools again of logic and so on, in particular modal logic, the logic of necessity and possibility. And a very brilliant man, then actually a boy, Saul Kripke, produced a semantics for a modal logic, a system of modal logic when he was at high school in Nebraska. And this was published when he was about 15 or 16, maybe he was 17 by the time it was published. But it was very, very powerful because before people had talked about possibility and necessity, but they hadn't really done the logic to work out what are called models or interpretations of these. But he produced one. And he went on to make very significant contributions. But just to give a flavor of how this became revisionary, if I may, a colleague of Kripke's at Princeton, that they had both been at Harvard at one point, David Lewis, took the issue of possibility and he said, well, look, if we say it's possible that zebras might have had horns in the center of their forehead, as it were, in their heads, then that's equivalent to saying there's some world in which it's possible that there are zebras with horns. Well, the way of understanding that is there just are worlds of which it's true. So he came up with this possible world semantics, as it's called, that interpreted talk about possibility in terms of the existence of possible worlds. And he really was saying there are as many possible worlds as there are possibilities, because that's just what possibilities, how they should be interpreted. And he said that the actual world, the one that we inhabit, is only differentiated from the possible worlds in the way that the term here differentiates from the term there, right? So I can say there's there, over there, but that's not where I am, I'm here, okay? Or there's then, looking to the past, or will be looking to the future, but there's now. So Lewis's view was that the actual world is just like being here and now, but it's no more real than all these other possible worlds. Now, this seems to me, by any stretch of the imagination, to just be insane. You know, if you think the right way of treating the logic of the world, the word possible, is to say there are as many actual worlds, well, actual is a technical term, but there are as many real worlds as the one you happen to inhabit, just is sort of, you know, you'd have to sort of take a breath and say, maybe we should take a step back and rethink the issue. Now, that's what I would call revisionary metaphysics. You know, you thought there's the world, and then there are things that are possible in the world. Well, the right understanding is there's an infinity of real worlds of which this happens just to be the one you're in. So that's an example of revisionary metaphysics. And you know, I could continue with other examples. Some people think there's only one object, and everything else that exists are just modifications or aspects of the one object. Some people think there aren't any objects. Some people think that, and so on and such like, right? So it's all become rather sort of extravagant, the very sort of thing that Russell and Moore were concerned to try to pare away at. So,
and it's not something that I think that Kripke necessarily.
no, Kripke didn't think this.
Yeah.
No, Kripke thought that possibles. Kripke took a view actually that it's somewhat Thomistic. I mean, I don't mean in any sense was he connected. Well, essentially, but actually about possibility. I mean, he thought that all possibilities are rooted in actualities, which is a Thomistic view, right? So to say that it's possible that so-and-so is to say that some actuality has a potentiality. There's something about, this glass. If I say it's possible this glass would break, I'm saying there's some characteristic of this glass. It's currently unbroken, but there's some potentiality in terms of its structure and so on, which is such that if I were to do something to it, it would break, right? But to talk about possibilities is not to talk about other worlds. It's just to talk about the potentialities of things in the actual world and so on. And Kripke took that line as well. I should say, completely ignorant of the fact of anything about Thomistic philosophy. Maybe I just say something about activism and the moral and political side. Yeah. So I think the moral and political activism is somewhat different, though one might think it has equally extravagant consequences in some cases. But it was a bit different. It was actually in part a reaction to quietism on the part of moral and political philosophers. Moral and political philosophers were saying through the 50s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, the task of moral or political philosophy is just to examine the basic concepts. But given the rise of philosophy in America, I mean, basically, how I have sometimes put it, if you were in 5th century Greece through to through 4th, 3rd, and so on centuries, if you were alive in that period, you would want to be in Greece, right? Because that's where philosophy was. In the 13th century, you'd want to be in Paris, and then in Oxford. In the 19th century, Oxford, Cambridge, London, and so on. And then by the beginning of the 20th century, it moves to Harvard and then Stanford and places on the way. So philosophy by the 1960s really had moved to America. I mean, of course, there was still important English language philosophy being done in Britain and so on, but it had become the center of philosophical activity. Harvard, Princeton, Stanford. I mean, a whole series of institutions. Pittsburgh, interestingly, Berkeley, talking about such. But anyway, of course, the social context in which philosophy was being done there, in that style of just describing, not prescribing and so on, however, was one in which the civil rights movement was happening, the Vietnam War was happening and so on and such like. The women's movement was going, the gay movement was starting up and all the rest of it. So you had philosophers who were saying it's not our business to say anything about how we ought to live and all the rest of it. And then around you got all these people who are fighting for civil rights or pacifist movements or justifications of the war and so on and such like going on. And I think some philosophers began to feel that this is crazy. I mean, how could we call ourselves moral philosophers or political philosophers and have really nothing to say about moral and political issues? And many of them were, in their own person, committed to some of these issues. So there began, really, in the 1960s, this sense of we have to say something, that we have to use our philosophical gifts and talents to try to not only analyze the concepts, but try to see what the implications, the real-life implications of these analyses are. And the first and most prominent product of that movement, really, was John Rawls's Theory of Justice, published in 1971, in which Rawls very astutely, acutely, brilliantly, and with real moral seriousness, tries to answer the question, what are the conditions under which we can live justly together? And so he has an exploration of justice, and it has certain implications for, broadly speaking, leftist welfareism. But he was a kind of welfare liberal. Thought that freedom mattered, welfare matters, and we've got to try to bring these together and so on. But that began really a whole movement. A journal was founded called the Journal of Philosophy and Public Affairs, not the Journal, just Philosophy and Public Affairs. I was one of a number of others who established a centre for philosophy and public affairs in St Andrews. That was the first in the UK that was sort of doing that kind of thing. And this is a movement, as it were, from Quietism to sort of enter into ethical and political debate. But what I think then happened, and I'm now talking about the last 15 so years, is that activist movements that were around gender issues, sexual issues, a whole series of issues, environmental issues and so on, these became more and more prominent in politics. Politics in the US and in the UK and in France and Italy and so on is less now about parties than it is about issues. It's really issues that people identify with and battle over. And so a new generation of people who've grown up with this kind of politics, you've got to be committed to this or committed to that or against this or for that and so on. And that made its way into philosophy, and because some of those people were philosophers. But already we'd had with Rawls the idea that philosophy can have something to say about these issues. That has produced in recent times a very high degree of activism, where people use their philosophical skills and knowledge to promote certain positions. Now, apart from the fact that I think this, to some extent, is taking us too far away from philosophical inquiry, this is the via media we've got to find out. I think also it risks a certain kind of corruption. There was something in the United States that the term advocacy scholarship came to be coined about 20 or so years ago, maybe 25 years ago, which was a term used to describe scholars using their prestige as scholars to advocate for particular ethical and political positions, but not necessarily being too conscientious about how that scholarship was used. So they were using their position, but in ways that might blur the actual results of scholarship. So what scholarship in a given historical issue, for example, or an ethical issue might show might actually be inconvenient to the position for which they wanted to advocate. But nonetheless, their position, or even if it's inconvenient, might not fully support it, let's just say, they use their position as scholars to advocate. And so what you'd get is people saying, well, this isn't just a matter of, my political views and so on. This distinguished philosopher or historian or whatever else it might be over here has shown that, okay? And this just drags it brought them into the public square, and then when the lights were on, they quite liked that. And so they were a little less conscientious, shall we say, about whether the scholarship actually supported the activism. And I think that's become now just a feature that people are less interested in what the argument might or might not show than they are in finding justifications for their positions and using. So in one sense, it's not at all unlike not very good Christian apologetics, where you'll say, not say anything, but you know what I mean? You'll just
Absolutely.
Throw everything onto the table and support your position and so on.
Yeah,
precisely. It's a reverse engineering. I think that's true. So what would you try to show that was true or favor that?
And there's an interesting, contemporary debate right now too, that what should drive metaphysics? Should it just be like this inquiry that you're talking about, or should it be ethics? Should we start with the ethical positions?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, take, for example, just give one example which brings these two sides together, the ethical and the metaphysical, the question of gender identity and sexual identity and one to this sort.
Metaphysics, right?
So people are actually but saying, look, we know what the truth of the matter is because our commitments tell it what it is. Mm-hmm. So let's now just do some philosophy that will give support to that. And so it's very common for people to say now that all of these categories, for example, are just socially constructed. They don't correspond to any independently existing reality. So we're back in a way to the sort of idealism in a funny sort of sense that says the world is what we make of it. And here's what we're going to make of it. And what the determinant of making things is something like justice. So we've got an idea of how the world ought to be. And then we're just going to bring the world into shape. But not just by having policies that engage with it, but by actually saying, look, our philosophy shows that this is what the world is like. And so that tends to be very revisionary and so on.
So you are encouraging, especially in your lecture, this via media, this middle path then. So how do we take what's good in those two tendencies or those two trends in contemporary academic philosophy in particular and salvage what can be salvaged and yet, let the other go?
So how I sort of want you to try to imagine this is if you think of, as it were, a pie or a pan-forte cake or whatever, and so on. And you think of it, as it were, with where it's going to be sliced, or maybe it's already been sliced, but maybe let's not slice it. Let's just sort of draw lines where it's going to be sliced. I think in a way this, or if you were, imagine an umbrella that with coloured sections, and you're looking down on it from above. So what you've got basically is a circle divided into sections, and obviously we've got a centre and we've got a periphery here. Okay. So I think this is a sort of picture of philosophy. That's to say, philosophy has its different compartments or departments or sections, right? There's philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of science, there's ethics, there's politics, there's aesthetics, mind, metaphysics, and so on. So think of those as being, as it were, the slices of the cake, so to speak. But it also has, as it were, in each of these sections has, as it were, a periphery and a center, okay? So I would say that the center of philosophy is, broadly speaking, metaphysics, something like that, right? I mean, I'm using metaphysics as an extended sense, but as it were, an account of the nature of reality, of thought and its relation to reality and so on. Let's just call that metaphysics. And then, but that's the center for all of those sections, if you think about it, right? Because that's where all the sections meet, as it were, the points of these slices, so to speak. And then on the periphery, you've got, as it were, as you proceed from the center, say in the ethical, you think about general values, principles, and so on, but then you're thinking about their applications. And then as you move towards the edge, you're dealing with issues, okay? Now, what I would say is that the quietist, if I can put it that way, is somebody who refuses to do anything but move from the absolute central point, the still point of the turning world, right? The metaphysician who stays at the center of this and just says, no, everything else can turn, but this stays still.
Would you say that they're kind of trapped in meta-ethics and they don't go to normative?
Well, that would be it in the particular case of the ethical, but I think this could be true for every branch of this and so on. So there is where the still point of the turning world. And then you've got these others, they're the quietists, as it were. Oh, no, I just say, Om Mani Padme Hum, whatever it may be. Or I just say reality, substance, being, identity. And then out of the periphery, you've got these people who are just sort of breaking down the barricades and smashing the place up and all the rest of it. Now, what I think the via media is to see that, well, two things. One is that there really are these sections of philosophy, as it were. There are these, but of course, they're not sharp lines between them. But nonetheless, there are. You can see there's regions or territories and such like. But they all have this periphery center kind of relationship. And so I'd say that the via media is to recognize the importance of the center, but also to recognize the importance of the development out of the regions. But don't just, as it were, stay at the center, which will induce this, contemplative, quiet silence, or just, as it were, live on the edges, which would just turn you into an activist. You've got to check what you're doing at the edge or towards the edge against the center, but you've also got to bring what you've learned there back to the understanding of what's at the center. Mm-hmm. So it's really a kind of dynamic relationship between the more abstract metaphysical reflections and the more normative, engaged, often practical or whatever aesthetically engaged orientations there. And so the via media really is between these extremes of philosophy just as the central point, and nothing else is really philosophy, or philosophy is just operating at the outer edge, and everything else is just a kind of waste of time, or if you're going to use it, you just use it in this advocacy sense and so on. No, for philosophy to be creative, helpful, and responsible, it's answerable to these two, as it were, directions of movement. And in a way, you just have to sort of keep asking yourself, is what I'm thinking about over here, how does that relate to what, as it were, might be a possible correction provided from the center? But also, in the ways in which I'm thinking about the center, let me inform that thinking by what I'm discovering by moving down towards the edge of these things.
There's a lot of conversation today, too, about what's called public philosophy. And so I think they're trying to speak to that. I mean, I just went through a doctoral program, so I heard a lot about be sure to be committed to a public, to the exercise of public philosophy. Do you think this is born of this kind of tension between quietism or activism?
No,
or do you think...
I don't really say cynically exactly. I think if you want to try to understand academic life, the best way to do it is really through a kind of quasi-Marxist analysis. I don't mean that I'm a Marxist. I just mean a material analysis, right? If you want to understand why people behave, look at what the goods are that are on the table they're trying to secure, right? And one of the things, it's about resources. It's about resources, it's about position and things of that sort. Now, I call it a Marxist analysis. All I mean is look at what Marx would call the material conditions of intellectual inquiry. I mean, you don't need to be a Marxist to see this. You could be a conservative. I mean, Burke would have said the same thing, not quite using the same language. So I think that this move towards public philosophy as it were, in its noble manifestation, is to do with the idea that these questions matter, and they don't just matter to academics, they matter to everybody. And so we ought, as it were, to extend the conversation and take our thinking out to the world and so on. And that's a good, and we get the same thing, the public understanding of science and the importance of that. But I actually think if we want to, what the real material impulse in this is actually the crisis in the humanities, the funding of scholarship and research in the humanities, the marginalization of intellectual inquiry in a world that is increasingly, commercially driven and so on. So it's almost a kind of a survival mechanism, actually, to try to, it brings some benefits to those who are good at it and go out there because, they get a certain sort of fame or whatever else it may be, and they may get promotion within their institutions. But in terms that's for individuals, but in terms of the profession as such, it's really, as is going to be true in art history or across other fields, it's very much to do with the fact of how do we survive in a world that just seems to have less and less interest in what we do, and where funding is a challenge and various things and so on. So I think it's a noble aim, but often it has a base motivation.
Sure. For sure. When we talk about, so there's also the old age question about whether philosophy even makes progress or not. And so we were talking earlier about Iris Murdoch, but she famously presents the question at the beginning of her Sovereignty of Good. Murdoch saw philosophical practice as an ebb and flow, which kind of sounds like what you were just talking about with via media. And she said that philosophy can be seen as two currents of movements, a movement towards the building of elaborate theories, she writes, and a move back again towards the consideration of simple and obvious facts. She thought philosophy needed both, but perhaps in a way different from what you are suggesting. Generally speaking, would you argue that philosophy makes progress, or would you say that this is the wrong way to look at it?
Good question. Okay, so here's my view about that. I think that, sometimes people will say things like this. Look, philosophy just seems to go in a circle. We start with this and we argue, and we just come back to where we were. And if you look at what we're doing now, we seem to be having the same arguments that people had in the 19th century, the 18th century, the 17th century, the 16th century, all the way back to the very beginnings of philosophy. Nothing seems to have been resolved. Well, the first point I would make is that actually you can be moving in a circle, but still making progress because you can be spiraling, right? So in one sense, you come back to the same point, but not, as it were, at but at a higher level, so to speak. And I think that one thing that philosophy has achieved over the centuries, but in some ways, particularly in the modern period, and perhaps even more so in the last 100 and so years, maybe 150 years, has been a significant advance using techniques of logic and both formal, but also the informal logic and so on, to try to bring into greater clarity and sharp focus what some of these ideas that people have been debating for centuries are actually about. So one kind of progress is not the resolution of the issues, but greater clarity and understanding of what the possible resolutions are. Right. So that is progress. Just to understand. We're not just gesturing at possibilities. We're actually sort of seeing exactly what those possibilities would commit us to, and so on. So that's helpful. But the other thing I think is that the second thing just reflects, as we're on the human condition, if I can put it that way. It's that I think that the complexity of the world, in every sense, the complexity of the world of value, the complexity of the world, the arts or beauty or politics or science, whatever else it is, has the consequence that actually it's very difficult to arrive at a compelling single picture, as it were. And maybe there can't be a single picture. Maybe there'll just be a series of pictures, right? The way that the art looks at the world is just different from the way that science looks at the world. It's not that one is correct and the other one is incorrect. They just have different takes or different viewpoints on things. And how things will look from one viewpoint may be difficult to sort of integrate with how they look from a different viewpoint. How they look from above is different from how they look from below, so to speak. So I think we might just have to sort of recognize that the plurality and diversity of reality, if I can put it that way, is reflected in the plurality and diversity of views of reality. and it's just extremely difficult to try to form a comprehensive picture. Plato introduced the theory of forms. He then seems to back away from the theory of forms. He introduces a second account of the theory of forms. Platonists, his followers, partly reject the theory of forms. There's a reassessment. Aristotle, for all of these great figures, they make important contributions. Part of it is, as it were, the spiralings I talked about. But they all struggle to try to give a kind of comprehensive view. And I'm inclined to think that maybe there just isn't a comprehensive view. They're just a series of stories. I don't mean fictional stories. I mean a series of accounts and so on. And that it's just a mistake to try to look for a single count of things that would be, well, just that, a single account of everything. So that might be part of what explains. And then, of course, you've just got things like human fallibility and one thing and another. I'm due to give contribute to a conference at Ave Maria University in February or March.
Is this on sin?
On original sin.
I'll be there too.
Will you be there? All right.
I'm giving you a paper.
Well, I shouldn't sort of advertise too much, right? Because I haven't written it yet. But my thought, but I do want to talk about the implications of original sin for philosophy itself, right? I mean, and that's more to be said about that. But when Thomas is writing about original sin in the Summa, he quotes Bede, though I don't think anybody's ever found a source in Bede where Bede says this. But the three natural effects of original sin are the darkening of the intellect, the disturbance of the passions, and the irresolution of the will. And, the darkening of the intellect may bear upon something like philosophy, because philosophy is that point at which, as it were, intellect is most tested. So, interesting question. So we've got pluralism, complexity, and sin as part of the answer.
Well, so but that's fascinating because, I mean, and to go back to what Murdoch was saying, you have these two currents, but I think she's dichotomizing. And in some ways, when I hear what you're saying about the via media, you're saying, no, they can go hand in hand, maybe even in the same, philosophical article, if you will, whereas she saw them as separate movements. Would you agree with that kind of understanding? In order to spiral in this positive sense and to build up and make progress in philosophy, are both currents needed in the same endeavor, or?
Yes, I think perhaps that's right. I mean, I don't want to oversimplify this because these movements are complex, but let me just give you an example from a different field, not philosophy, from art. My initial higher education was in fine art. I did 5 years of that, and I taught art, and I taught in an architecture school and so on, and then I turned to philosophy. But during the transition and afterwards, partly precisely because as I moved away particularly from the practice of art, I did more art criticism. I'd write sort of introductions to catalogues or exhibitions or review exhibitions or write about art. Not about aesthetics, but about art. Anyway, it seems to be, so you could think about this, somebody who's got that range of interest from art making through art criticism to philosophy and so on. So your relationship to art could be very complex. You could sometimes be making art, right? At other times, you might be, as it were, thinking about how well you or somebody else has done in the making of a particular piece. That's the art critical phase. And then the other one, more general one, is the thing, so well, what's art for? What's the value? What's the meaning and significance and so on? Now, I think you can embody all three of those perspectives, right? You could be both an art maker, and that would inform your art criticism, and your art criticism would inform your philosophical thinking, and then you could sort of move between these. Now, I think in philosophy, of course, the picture I've just given would require you really to be thinking, say, if you're doing philosophy of science, you'd have to know quite a lot about science, not necessarily be a working scientist. But I think it's a good thing if philosophers do know something about something other than philosophy, because they can then. But yes, and that's what I'm saying is there's a kind of movement in which each informs the other, each phase or stage or aspect informs the other. Think about the practice, how does that inform the philosophy? Think about the philosophy, how does that inform the practice, and so on. So I wouldn't want to dichotomize these. I'd see them more, as it were, as aspects or directions or tendencies. But part of my story about the via media is not to let a tendency carry you too far away.
No, that's very helpful. I think that's very insightful, in fact. So with respect to your current situation, you've been a visiting professor at the Angelicum this past semester. You've been surrounded by a lot of Thomists, you know what I mean? And so there are different styles of doing Thomism, of course. But one of the popular trends, if you will, in Thomism is what is called, and you kindly coined it, analytic Thomism. So, do you think that Thomists today fall into this sort of tension that you note between quietism on the one hand and activism on the other, or do you think
That's interesting.
they escape that sort of temptation?
Yeah. Well, I think insofar as they're Thomists, which is to say, however they may differ in their particular approaches, but if they're inspired by Thomas, and have either trained themselves or been trained in the reading of Thomas and so on, they couldn't help but notice that Thomas addresses a vast number of topics and fields, right? There's almost nothing really that doesn't get applied. I mean, I think one area in which I think he's a bit weak actually is aesthetics, but that's not altogether surprising because the very subject of aesthetics didn't really come into being until the 18th century. But at any rate, so that the range of interests and the effort to have a comprehensive view, not necessarily a single unified, but to have a view, as it were, across the breadth of things, I think it should be honoured as a feature of Thomistic approaches. Having said that, I suppose there's really sort of two divisions, broadly speaking, among Thomists, and then there are subdivisions within these. But one, as it were, is the attempt to try to just to articulate, make clear, and get what seems a sound account of what Thomas himself thought on certain subjects. I don't want to call that a merely historical undertaking, so I don't think it's just that. It's not just as we're looking at the dating of texts and whether he was in fact the author of this or whatever else it may be and so on. But it is trying to just get very clear about, what the Thomistic view is, not just from a spectatorial point of view, but to endorse it, right? So these people were committed to Thomas, and they think that the reason they're committed to Thomas is because they think Thomas is a great thinker, and so they want to exhibit the greatness of Thomas and see how it can be applied to different issues and so on. So they're really focused on Thomas and his texts. And then you've got people who think, well, no, I'm a Thomist in the sense that, as it were, I'm in line with Thomas, but I'm not particularly interested in the question of text. I mean, I'll give an example of this, by the way. I remember there was a quite distinguished scholar called Joseph Owens, who was at the Pontifical Toronto, as PIMS, the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies, where Gilson had been instrumental in the establishment of that. And there were a number of Armand Maurer, there were a number of good Basilians, as it happened, actually. Though there was a Dominican Osmond Lurie, who died early. But at any rate, and I remember in 1987, I think it was, being invited to go to the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies, to visit and so on. And I had a lunch, and there was Armand Maurer, there was Joseph Owens, a number of these, all gone now, but any of those figures. And I said to Joseph Owens, I'm very interested in the question of truth. I mean, philosophical theories of truth and so on. And I know I've read the Thomas so far as I can, these parts, but I really not quite sure, I need to get clear about that, but I also need to see what the implications of that be. So I said, would, for example, Thomas be inclined to say so-and-so? And he said, Thomas didn't address that. I said, no, but I mean, if he had addressed that, would he be inclined to say? He said, no, he didn't write about that. And then I tried a third time, and I saw I wasn't going to get anywhere. So I'm not criticizing that. I'm just saying that's one perspective. Mm-hmm. Now, what happened in Thomism, as you will know, in the 20th century was that partly in an effort, I mean, with Aeterni Patris in 1879, which was the initiative really that revived the place of Thomism within Catholic thought and medieval thought more generally, actually, had been revived. There was a sort of sense of just getting clear about what Thomas thought, and that was all there was to think, as it were. And the modern philosophy was really, a source of distraction and error, was basically the view, famous syllabus of errors. But that produced among Thomists, I think, two reactions. One was for people to say, no, that's right. So there was a sort of conservative Thomism, I can put it that way. What was the phrase? The Thomism of the, I forget, there was a French author. It wasn't Garrigou Lagrange, but at any rate, it was kind of dogmatic Thomism, I think. Yeah. But then the other action was to say, no, if we've to show that it's a credible position, we've got to show how it can engage with other philosophical systems, such as Kant, for example. And that produced something called Transcendental Thomism, Marischal, and all the way through to Bernard Lonergan, who was here in Rome at the Gregorian, Canadian thinker. And then you had others emphasizing, because they wanted to say what was unique to Thomas and that would even transcended Aristotle, which was being, the understanding of being, the act of being, and so on. So you had these so-called existential Thomists, and on it went. Now, when I coined the term analytical Thomism, there was a bit of pushback, particularly when that got attention and got written about a bit, and people started to use the term. There were a lot of Thomists who thought, oh, this is another of these takeover bids. We had the transcendental Thomists trying to ditch authentic Thomism and replace it with a sort of neo-Kantianism. And we had the existential Thomists trying to tell us the only, the existence is the thing and all the rest of it. And I just should say that was never part of what analytical Thomism was about. And I think that it was analytical Thomism was an attempt to try to deploy and bring to bear some of the methods and techniques of philosophy, modern philosophy that I've been talking about, on ideas, philosophical questions, and the answers to those questions provided by Aquinas himself and by subsequent interpreters and people like Cajetan and Suarez and so on, these other figures. So it wasn't meant to be another kind of Thomism. It was meant to be, as it were, a synthesis of Thomistic substance and analytic form, if I can put it that way. That has proven fruitful. It's been very encouraging, I think, particularly for younger people, people who wanted to be part of the secular philosophical world, but also, authentically bringing the tradition to bear and things of that sort. And that has really grown quite significantly, particularly in the United States. And I think partly the coining of the term, but also a Thomistic seminar that I ran in Princeton for about 10 years each summer and so on, which brought in a large number of graduate students and young faculty or early stage faculty, provided a sort of community and a sense of common purpose and such like. And if you look at those figures who might now self-describe as analytic Thomists, or even if they wouldn't describe as that, would say, no, that's something that interests me. I think that's, they're working all sorts of issues in all sorts of fields. And there's no sort of dogmatic unity to it. So, yeah, I think that things actually, as they stand now, more generally, I think are better and stronger than they were, say, 40 years ago. And I see this, by the way, in the American Catholic Philosophical Association, which when I first encountered it was, it wasn't quite clear to me what its future was. And I think it's just looking stronger than it's been for a very long time.
Having just been there in Notre Dame, where it was just, I think exactly what you're talking about, an engagement of contemporary ideas and a kind of translation project in the meantime. But I want to thank you, Dr. Haldane, for being here today, especially for this insightful conversation. And for our viewers, I hope it has been very insightful. Not only has Dr. Haldane, spelled out for us these two tendencies, but he's suggested what this middle path is supposed to look like for us. So thank you to all our listeners for joining us for this episode of Angelicum Conversations. We hope you'll continue to follow our series as we explore the great themes and questions of philosophy and theology and the life of the church. Thank you.
Thank you very much.